Hey there, today we're going to be taking a look at what is currently right now the cheapest Black Friday laptop that Walmart actually has available, and that is the IdeaPad 1. This is a 15-inch laptop. Now the specs of the system are a Ryzen 3 7520U paired with 8GB of RAM, and that is soldered RAM, so no upgradability whatsoever, but it is rated at 5500 mega transfers per second. So it's not LPDDR5X, but it is LPDDR5. But of course, only 8GB is going to be very limiting, especially with Windows 11. This also comes with a 256GB SSD, and one of the biggest downsides of the entire system itself is the fact that while it is a 1080p display, it is a TN panel. That's right, 2023, and we're still dealing with laptops with TN panels. Manufacturers somehow still manage to keep this dead technology alive by finding the absolute cheapest hardware on the market and just slapping it on there. Even though you could pick up IPS displays for extremely cheap prices nowadays, at these ultra low budget prices, manufacturers are going to do everything that they can to save a buck. Now the system also comes with a 65-watt charger, and taking the whole system out of the box and actually giving it a first look, I was rather surprised. Now obviously the entire body is plastic, it's going to be plastic at this price point, but it felt solid enough, though the keyboard itself didn't exactly feel great to use. I've felt far worse at this price point. I do find though that the body of the system itself does end up picking up fingerprints and just human grease very easily, and that's very annoying. I have to constantly be cleaning this thing, so that can become a pretty major problem. An interesting feature is that the system actually does come with a fingerprint reader, and it does seem to be very effective. It works perfectly fine every time I've used it. A nice feature to have on here, but that TN display really drags down the overall experience. But talking about the actual hardware itself, we're looking at a Ryzen 3 7320U. Now this is a chip that might be a little confusing to you because you see 7000 series and you might think, well, okay, this is probably a very modern chip. But the chip in here is from AMD's Mendocino line. Now Mendocino is AMD's very low-end chips that are designed almost similarly to how the Steam Deck's chip is designed, in that it pairs a older Zen 2 architecture with RDNA 2 based graphics. But unlike the Steam Deck, which was pretty much optimized for giving you a nice balance of gaming performance at a low wattage, this is just pairing a Zen 2 based CPU with only 2 RDNA 2 cores. Now their clock speed is relatively decent, going up to 1900 megahertz. But considering the clock speeds that RDNA 2 in general tends to hit, it's not exactly impressive, especially considering that the core count is significantly smaller than the rest of the RDNA 2 based iGPUs. The lowest end one that we've tried, of course, being the 6600H, which had only 6 RDNA 2 cores, and this is already rocking just 1/3 of that. So don't expect any decent gaming performance, but we will take a look at some games that can actually run on a system like this. But really, I think that a huge pain of the system is actually going to end up being that 8GB of RAM that is non-upgradable. Of course, for day-to-day tasks like using the web browser and things like that, I don't expect it to be too much of a problem, but we'll see when we actually take a look at the actual system running, and let's just jump right on into it. So immediately jumping into the system, I wanted to take a look at what kind of bloatware we're dealing with, since this is a OEM system. And of course, here we have McAfee security, we have the typical Windows bloat, but outside of that, besides McAfee, Amazon Alexa, and Lenovo's own Vantage software, there wasn't really much in terms of OEM included bloatware. That being said, I did nuke all of this, as I also nuke all of the Microsoft bloatware every time I do a fresh install of Windows 11. So after running through the entire process of just deleting all of the background applications that I just never use, like OneDrive, I wanted to see what the RAM utilization was looking like. And immediately I knew I was going to be in for a very brutal battle, because here you get to see what the system is doing just with the Windows Updater running in the background. As you can see, the Ryzen 3 7320U is more than capable of having enough cores to feed this process, but that memory utilization is ridiculous. Now you might notice that the maximum amount of RAM that it says that we have available to us is 5.7 gigabytes, even though the system is supposed to have 8 gigabytes of RAM. Well, the reason being is that in the BIOS, by default, it allocates 2 gigabytes of VRAM to the iGPU. I don't understand why they have done this. This is not a gaming system. That extra allocation of VRAM is not going to do any favors for you in terms of performance anyway when it comes to gaming, but having those 2 gigabytes of VRAM pretty much just sitting there doing nothing because they're allocated to just sit around doing nothing when you're just doing normal day-to-day tasks means that you have even less VRAM to work with here, or rather you have less RAM in general to work with. And that creates this scenario where all that's happening is a regular update process is running in the background, and our RAM utilization is already almost at 80%. That is no web browser open, that is Steam not even open. This is just Windows sitting on its desktop and deciding, okay, it's update time. And this is what the RAM utilization looks like. And just as I suspected, nothing that I did was actually going to make the RAM utilization any better. Because even after uninstalling everything that comes pre-installed, like the Vantage software and all of that, the memory utilization at idle was still around 3 gigabytes. So the lowest I could get the utilization to get to with nothing open was 50%, and we open anything and suddenly we're pretty much using all of it. This really gave me flashbacks of the old days when I had a Windows Vista PC that really did not meet the spec requirements of Windows Vista. But now, how does this translate to real-world performance? Well, in Cinebench R23, we ran the system, and I did put it in its high performance mode in the BIOS just to give it its best possible chance. It seems that when you put it in the extreme performance, you get a TDP of around 25 watts, though it really seems to level out at more around 20 watts. So I think 25 watts is just the short burst duration, and then the sustained is 20 watts. While by default, it has a target of around 15 watts, though it tends to drop down from there, but it's mostly because the chip doesn't really need all that wattage in a lot of things. But at its maximum performance, the multi-core performance actually ended up giving us pretty similar results to Intel's 11th generation 4-core 8-thread i7 at 28 watts, which is a very interesting result to see for sure, though the single-core performance was nowhere near what those can actually do. So in day-to-day tasks, that Intel system is going to feel in general faster, but in those multi-core workloads, this is actually going to give you pretty similar results to that. Now, how does it compare to systems in similar price points to it? Well, it's going to completely demolish pretty much any system based on any Pentium or Intel processor series. So if you see Pentium Gold, Pentium Silver, or anything like that, or if you just see a generic Intel processor label, this is going to be faster than it, which is what's mostly within its price range. But you don't need to spend that much more money to actually start to get into higher end chips that actually give you a pretty much meaningful uplift in terms of performance. For example, the HP Pavilion laptop that I have used on my channel for multiple years with the Ryzen 5 5500U, I actually picked up for $300 from Walmart, and you can actually still find it available today. Now, It has not moved in terms of price. That's mostly due to manufacturers essentially putting newer generations at higher price points instead of really bringing down overall prices. But still, this is pretty much spending an extra $50 and you get an IPS display, you get a better feeling keyboard, you get an overall nicer feeling chassis. It's still 8 GB of RAM, but it is upgradable this time around, so you can actually put in as much RAM as you want. You can go all the way up to 64 if you want. And we upgrade from the 7320U to the Ryzen 5 5500U. Now again, I know you're going to get confused because you see 7000 series and you think, well, how is that not just way better than anything 5000 series? And again, it's because these Mendocino chips are weird amalgamations of just old and new technology, creating something that is interesting, but unfortunately isn't really competitive. See, because this has 4 cores and 8 threads of Zen 2, it actually gets beaten out by the 6 cores and 12 threads of Zen 2 in the Ryzen 5 5500U, and it gets absolutely demolished in terms of single core performance by the 5600U. And that's not to mention its real main competitor here, and that is the i3 series. You can find i3 laptops that actually perform CPU-wise noticeably better than this, and GPU-wise not really noticeably worse. Because at the end of the day, what this chip really is just a replacement to the 3200U, which was a dual-core, 4-thread, original Zen architecture-based chip with only 3 Vega cores at a pretty low clock speed. And what this does in comparison to that is essentially double the core count, move from a 14 nanometer Global Foundries based architecture over to a 7 nanometer TSMC based one. So a massive increase in IPC in terms of single core performance, and the doubling of core count, as well as that increased IPC and the movement to a faster overall memory technology, does mean that there is a pretty massive uplift to what it is essentially replacing, since the 5300U never really materialized into anything. Well, in terms of replacing that, it does seem like a meaningful uplift, even though we do see a regression in terms of overall core count on the iGPU. The pretty massive uplift in terms of performance that comes with RDNA 2 does actually lead to a pretty meaningful uplift in terms of gaming performance. But again, relative to the 3200U, when you compare it to systems that are around its price point or not far from it, it really just can't hold its own in terms of the iGPU performance, except against the extreme low end of the Intel product stack. Now, even towards the middle section, it is competitive enough. Really, none of these systems are going to be GPU powerhouses, but we can actually jump over and see what the GPU can actually do, since it is based on RDNA 2. And now I know you might be thinking it was very optimistic of me to run Alien Isolation at the ultra graphics settings at 1080p on this system, but we have seen this game perform really well on low-end systems at ultra graphics. So it is pretty disappointing to see the level of performance that we were getting in this game right now, but it's not too surprising since, again, the 610M is pretty limited. It is 2 RDNA 2 cores running at 1900 megahertz. Now, annoyingly, for some reason, MSI Afterburner just refused to read the clock speeds that the 7320U was actually running at, so I could only tell you the percentage usage, but I can't show you the actual clock speeds, which is very disappointing to see. But also, you'll see that the TDP that we're reaching here is not exactly an extreme one. We're not even really fully utilizing 15 watts most of the time, and that kind of just comes down to the fact that we definitely don't need a lot of CPU for this game, and feeding 2 RDNA 2 cores doesn't exactly require that much juice. You can see that the GPU is pretty much locked at its maximum clock speed the whole time, so we're extremely GPU limited at this point, and you can see that the game itself is really struggling here. Now, I felt a little bad for essentially humiliating the system with what was essentially supposed to be a slam dunk, and it absolutely fell on its face. So I decided to try out BioShock Infinite, but this time with the very low graphics settings. And in this, it was actually able to give us a pretty decently playable experience, though nothing incredible, specifically because of the 1% lows. But what this does show us is that you are going to be gaming capable, even for AAA titles. You just have to be very flexible with the release date of them. Now, there is pretty much an endless library of really fantastic old titles and extremely light titles that will run on practically anything, so you do have some playability here. Another example of a game that runs really well on here is actually Grid 2, a game that we very frequently test. It just has a very good built-in benchmark, and it's a game that looks still really good at whatever graphics settings you set it to. This is set to the very low graphics settings, and visually speaking, I still find it to be very appealing, and this gives it some pretty great levels of performance, as you can see here. So again, you're going to be able to play a large amount of games. I don't want you to feel discouraged if you already have a system with this chip. I understand what it's like when this isn't a question of getting a $250 system versus a $300 system. It's getting a $250 system or getting nothing at all, where an extra $50 or even $80 is so hard to come by that you have to make a decision to either get nothing or to at least have something. And if you have at least something, which is this, you are going to be able to play a lot of really fun games on here. Especially if you're looking to do emulation, at least emulating the GameCube using Dolphin, which is about really the only emulation I ever really do. But I do plan on testing now PlayStation 2 ROMs very soon, so stay tuned for a dedicated video on that. But the performance, at least here, with LEGO Star Wars 2, the original trilogy, it's pretty fantastic. We're actually able to upscale the game up to 1080p, and it does look very nice and crisp, while giving us a rock solid 60 FPS average. And this carried over to Double Dash, which I was also able to upscale to 1080p to a near perfect gaming experience. It would usually have at least one stutter at the beginning of a race, and then it would pretty much just be perfect from there on. But that did affect the 1% lows. But in general, the actual gaming experience was really fun. Of course, I did want to try out a modern title, and that was BattleBit Remaster, considering that it is a game that visually doesn't look incredible, so it seems to be designed to run on absolute potatoes, with its lowest graphics settings even being labeled as potato. So it stands to reason that I would expect some pretty decent performance on here, and I was pleasantly surprised. While our 1% lows weren't incredible for a first-person shooter game like this, our FPS average was pretty decent, and if you actually go with the potato quality settings, they set a lower render resolution, something around 75%. I set it all the way back up to 100% just because I wanted to get this at 1080p, but if you're going to actually play yourself, I would actually just leave it at the 75 that the potato quality sets it to, because that's actually going to get you a nice increase in terms of your 1% lows. But of course, this means that this system is going to do a decent job at playing games like Roblox and Minecraft as well. So like I said, you're going to have a pretty wide library of games that you're actually going to be able to play on a system like this. The biggest enemy of this system is really just the fact that out of the box, the system itself is pretty much just utilizing most of the RAM just sitting there doing nothing. And this means that when you open up a browser like Firefox or Google Chrome or anything like that, the rest of your memory is going to get eaten up extremely quickly. And even if you go through and uninstall all of the extra crap that is installed on the system, it still doesn't solve most of the problems, since Windows 11 just in general likes to eat up all of your system RAM running a lot of background tasks that you don't even care about. So if this system has some pretty decent levels of performance but is essentially being held back by Windows 11, well, what could we do? Well, we have two options. We could either go to Windows 10, which would be kind of a problem since RDNA 2 wasn't really designed to work on Windows 10. It was pretty much optimized straight out of the box. For Windows 11, it doesn't really seem like that great of an option, and we're still looking at relatively high RAM utilization. And look, utilization isn't necessarily a bad thing. You want your system RAM to be used for things. It's kind of what it's there for. but you want those things that it's being used for to be things that you actually care about. I really don't need my antivirus to just suddenly start running in the background. I really don't need OneDrive to just suddenly decide to start talking to Microsoft servers in the background and just start eating up CPU cycles for no reason and just sitting there in the memory eating up space. If you're going to utilize all of my RAM, please be efficient with it and use it for the things that I want to do with it, not what you as a company think it should do with it. So what's the solution here? Well, we could always install Linux. Now, instead of turning this into a 45-minute video talking just about what distro I was going to go with, I just went with Nabara Linux. Now, this is a version of Fedora that essentially comes with a bunch of one-click solutions for installing a lot of essential software that you're going to need to just get your computer to work properly. Specifically, the one that I find the most interesting is installing the patented media codecs and libraries. This is pretty much what you need to get hardware acceleration to work on Linux, and this is extremely important for any kind of modern system because pretty much every system comes with a built-in chip that will encode and decode pretty much any kind of video format used online. And one of the benefits of this being based on RDNA 2 is that it has the most recent media engine, which even has AV1 decoding. But to actually access any of this, we need to pretty much run this installer here, and it'll pretty much install everything that we need for us. And it has been the easiest experience that I've ever had with getting hardware acceleration to actually work on Linux. And once you actually have hardware acceleration working on Linux, the desktop experience is just pretty much identical to Windows, at least in terms of day-to-day tasks that just involve using the web browser. And with things like Google Docs and Office 365 all pretty much just running on a browser anyway, with a Linux laptop that is not dedicated to gaming, you can pretty much just do everything that you're really going to realistically want to do. Now, they also have a bunch of additional things like recommended software to install, things like Kdenlive if you want to edit video and stuff like that. On a system like this, we're not exactly going to have an amazing experience, but they do also have their own software center where you can go here and look up any software that you would like to install. Firefox is the default browser on here, so that's already pre-installed, but it makes it extremely easy to install things like GIMP, which is the photo editor that I actually use on a pretty much daily basis. All my thumbnails have always been made on GIMP. And of course, Telegram messaging, which is something that I use every day to talk with my friends. And it makes it extremely easy to actually install most software that you're going to want to use. And I find this to be a lot more usable than the Microsoft Store because it's not filled with a bunch of crap that could best be described as just mobile shovelware. This pretty much just gives you all of the software that you would actually realistically want to use. Now, after all the updates and everything have been done here, you can see just the web browser open right now after I installed uBlock Origin, which is pretty much necessary on the internet, much to YouTube's dismay. And trust me, I'm a YouTuber myself. I use this platform. I would prefer if people didn't use AdBlock, but I would be a hypocrite to tell you not to use it since I use it because the internet's awful without it. But it's funny to think that the entire system itself is using less than 3 gigabytes of RAM, even with a web browser already open. Now, trying to play back some 8K video on YouTube wasn't exactly a perfect experience. You're getting pretty frequent drop frames and you can see some noticeable stutter throughout the video itself. Not really a great experience, but it's a $250 laptop. I don't really think you're going to be hooking this up to an 8K display and watching anything anyway. Now, interestingly enough, while trying to watch the 8K video, our RAM utilization did go all the way up to 3.6, so still not touching the numbers that we were getting on Windows just existing on the desktop. Dropping down to 4K gives us a far more consistent experience, though there were still the occasional dropped frame here and there. So not exactly perfect, but still a far more usable experience. This is of course just playing it back on YouTube. Keep in mind though that all of this has been playing back at the AV1 codec on YouTube. So we do actually have full AV1 support here on Linux. At least it seems to be functional, though not exactly giving us the perfect level of performance that we'd like to see. It is still at least working. But like I said, what this really just does is it makes the system really good at day-to-day tasks. And that usually just means web browsing. So we're just going to use the web browser here to look up what its competition really is like here on Amazon, at least. At the $250 price range, we're really looking at a lot of Intel Celeron and Pentium-based systems. The i3 system there does seem kind of interesting, though it is a renewed model, and it is 11th generation. This Ryzen 3 5300U system is also kind of interesting, though by the looks of it, it doesn't seem to have an IPS display, so we could be dealing with TN yet again, though the GPU itself is actually an improvement, but it is only one stick of RAM, but it does actually have the slot so you can upgrade it yourself. Not a bad option overall if you're willing to shell out the extra almost $60 for it. In general, though, it's kind of a sea of mediocrity at around this price point. Definitely, if you can go up to around $350, you can actually start to find some pretty nice systems that will have meaningful upgrades overall. But at least in terms of competing with CPU performance, it's really hard to find anything that gets close to this at exactly $250, especially on a brand new system. And as I said before, if it's between getting this or getting nothing, getting this isn't a bad option. But if you can actually hold off and get an extra $50 to $80, you can get yourself a far better system that is going to have some noticeable improvements in usability. I mean, the biggest downside of this system, more than anything else, is just the TN display looks so bad. I really don't have the right camera equipment to properly show you just how bad the display is. But here I have actually the system hooked up to an external 13-inch OLED display that I have. Pretty much one of the best displays that I've ever purchased, and it cost me $80. And the color and brightness and overall enjoyability and usability is leagues ahead over the TN panel here, where realistically I could not enjoy watching this movie on the IdeaPad. To get anywhere even near a remotely passable image, you pretty much need to be looking at it straight on, which is pretty much the way that I have it angled right now in this video. This is as good as I could get the TN image to look, and any kind of directional shift up or down will cause it to start to look noticeably worse. And I get it, using an OLED is really cheating. Its main competition is IPS displays, but even the worst IPS displays that I have seen still beat out these absolutely terrible TN displays. So after using it for pretty much about a day and a half now, just to get my first impressions with it, what do I think of the system itself? Well, it's tough to say. I like the CPU itself. The CPU, I think a quad core based off of Zen 2 at this low of a price point is actually rock solid overall. The disappointing GPU performance was to be expected, but it's kind of sad to see because it's essentially a regression. That's why I say that this is really a replacement of the 3200U, not really a replacement to the 5300U, because the 5300U, while being a quad-core 8-thread system, it was based on Zen 3, and it had 6 Radeon Vega-based cores for its iGPU, which means that overall the gaming performance that it's going to have is just significantly better than this. So in terms of an upgrade, in terms of the 3200U, on paper it's a nice jump, but if you're on a system with a 3200U right now, is it worth upgrading to this? I would really just go with a system with a 5500U or an i5 1135G7 or anything like that you can find at around the $300 to $300 price range. But if this is your only option, this is like you either get this or you get nothing this Christmas, you're actually going to be able to do a lot with this. A lot more than what a lot of people will make you believe. They'll make you think, oh, a system this cheap, all you can do is just open up Excel. You saw it doing GameCube emulation, you saw it do gaming. It's just not incredible at any of that, but you can do it. it's just that display really drags down the usability, and the RAM. The lack of upgradable RAM really makes this system suffer a lot. If you want to improve your overall performance and you don't care about gaming at all, go into the BIOS and just set the allocated VRAM to the lowest that it can possibly go, so then you can just claw back as much of the system RAM as you can if you plan on continuing to use Windows. But if you want to be a Chad and install Linux on this thing, it actually does a pretty rock solid job, and I've been pretty happy with that overall. At least it's been enjoyable when I use the system hooked up to that external OLED. But we keep coming back to the main problem, that TN display is just so god awful that it makes it really unenjoyable to use the system. $250 is really ultra budget territory, so if you're shopping in this price range, I'm really guessing that that extra $50 to $80 is just going to cost you too much that it's not really viable for you. I mean, it's the holiday season already right now. If you cannot put together the money within that time, and it's go time now for whether or not you buy it, it's not a bad option. At $250, there's just nothing else that gives you this level of performance, but you're sacrificing a lot here, and to get the best experience, you are going to have to install something like Linux, or Windows is going to be overall really rough, unless all you're trying to do is just do schoolwork and stuff like that. If everything that you're going to do lives within the browser, you're pretty much in the clear. So that's using Office 365, Google Drive, Canvas, Blackboard, anything like that. All of that runs on computers that are at least a decade old at this point. So you're going to be perfectly fine with this. Just don't expect anything remarkable in terms of gaming performance. But overall, I do like the system, at least in terms of the CPU performance per dollar value is actually pretty high here. It's just that TN panel. I really wish manufacturers would just put the worst IPS displays they could find on the back of a truck rather than these TN displays. But anyways, I'll catch you guys next time.